Hi, I'm Alexander Zonjic, and you are watching Elements of Jazz TV.
Elements of Jazz, your visual jazz experience.
For me, it was guitar really early. I started playing guitar when I was about 8 years old. The flute didn't come along till much later. But, you know, wonderful childhood, really poor. We were poor kids. We grew up. In fact, it's odd because I spent so much time in Detroit. My mother and father never owned a car. They had this sense that it was an unnecessary expense. Family, my mother's Greek, but she was born in France. She spoke 9 languages fluently. So when I grew up, we heard everything. My father was Serbian, and he spoke about 4 or 5 languages. My brother was born in Italy, my grandmother in Turkey. I was actually born in Canada. So it was a wonderful, very multicultural, wonderful upbringing. Windsor, as you know, is right across from Detroit. So the influences of arguably one of the greatest music cities in the world were there right from the very beginning. And literally, someone sold me a flute on the street for $9 like you buy a watch. He came up and he said, "Aren't you that guitar player?" And I goes, "Yes. Would you like to buy a flute?" And that's kind of how it started, you know. And I don't want anyone to think that there was anything natural about it because I couldn't play it. It's just that I fell in love with the idea of playing it. And then I went back to university and studied. The thing about the flute that's so difficult, it's that square one when you first get it is not where other instruments are. I mean, I always make this comparison or this little analogy, more or less, is that if you take 4 people and put them in a room, and you give one a piano, and you give the other one a guitar, and you give the other a sax, and you give the other guy a flute, chances are in 6 months, it's the flute player who's still struggling. The other guys, because take the piano for example, if you go to the piano, I don't care if you're 3 years old or you're a concert pianist, if you push that note down, it comes out. Nothing comes out of that flute when you pick up that tube. It's very, very awkward, very, very difficult. So I'm not using that as an excuse, and I'm not suggesting other instruments aren't difficult, but I think there's a reason why there aren't a whole lot of us. I mean, where are they, you know? I mean, I love Nestor Torres, I love Dave Valentine, Hubert Laws is great, Herbie Mann was great, but there's not a lot of them. more jazzy than I am jazz. I mean, what I play is, it's funky, it's certainly a different It's a totally different world when I'm in this kind of a setting versus the classical setting, because people really don't expect that from a flute. They don't expect the flute to be that gritty and that, you know, they expect it to play bird sounds, you know, for the most part. You know, I don't really consider myself a jazz musician. My preoccupation is really more with being the best flute player I can be, not the best jazz musician. That's a real serious study. Maybe one day. I don't know. I really don't know. Growing up, certainly in the Detroit area, you were inundated by, especially being the age that I'm in, Motown was everything. So that was a huge influence, if not directly, certainly subliminally. You couldn't get around the fact, you know, we all went to the Motown reviews at the Fox Theater, and even though he wasn't a Motown act, we never missed James Brown when he came to Cobo Hall. So you saw all the greats. You saw them all. So that was big, big influence. And then, of course, there was the classical influence. So you take all the Motown acts, you add all the great classical players, and certainly in the flute world, you know, Jean-Pierre Rampal, the famous French flute player, James Galway, who's still alive, arguably one of the greatest flute players that's ever lived, big influences. Now you throw in the Hubert Laws and Herbie Mann, for example, and, you know, the combination of all that, you know, but there really are a lot of them. And I think even great jazz musicians, if you talk to them, it's not like if you're a piano player, the only person that ever influenced you was a great jazz pianist. It really is all music. The latest CD, Doing the D, is totally a tribute to Detroit. In spite of what you read about Detroit, in spite of what we hear, because we all know all the bad stuff, you know, and we all know they're having economic problems. We all know the crime. We all know all that. But that's such a small part of the story. The story there is, it is the greatest music city in the world as far as I'm concerned. Now throw in the fact they have a world-class symphony orchestra. They have an opera house. It is an amazingly rich city culturally. You know, you had great radio. It was all there, and so it was really, really, really rich. You know, and we could just get on a bus and go to Detroit and go to the Fox Theater and see Motown acts all day, and it really is, everything is there. I always welcome radio possibilities because it comes very natural to me. I love interviewing people. I've interviewed everyone in the country over and over again. They've all been on my show. And you bring things out of it because it's an artist talking to an artist. So I fell in love with it. I try to stay in it. So I'm staying in it right now with the syndicated show. I was doing live Sunday nights on an urban station right up until a couple of months ago. But every Sunday night I was doing live show on WGPR, and it was really cool. And still like to do TV. I do some stuff, you know. But for the most part, at the core of everything, I'm a flute player. That's what I do. Everybody needs somebody to play bass in their band and guitar in their band and keyboard. Nobody needs a flute player. Like, nobody needs one. So it's very, very unique when someone like a Bob James comes into a club and says, I want a flute player in my band. It really is quite unique. I was very lucky in that regard. So a lot of those musical heroes, Bob James, Earl Klugh, Jeff Lorber, Angela Bofield, I loved, you know, and I toured all over the world with her. I've got a list this long of people. And if you just take the newest record as an example, and all of my records, right from the very beginning, I made Elegant Evening in 1982, and Earl Klugh was on it. Then I made Romance with You around 84, 85, and Bob James was on it, and Earl Klugh was on it, and a bunch of other great New York musicians on it. So I've been very, very lucky with the collaborations, and I don't know what it is about that that's worked for me, and I think in most cases, the people that do this on the level that they do it, with all due respect that we got to make money, we got to pay bills, they just love doing it. They just love to do it. And I really think people recognize that in people. I mean, I recognize it in Jeff Lorber. I know he recognizes it in me, Bob James, Kirk Whalum. You know, we've worked together for years, you know. So it's a pretty cool little club, I think. And I'm thrilled to be a part of it.